When you say nation, you talk about land. Our land is Africa. That's undeniable. This land is not our land.
That what Frantz Fanon's theory, psychological theory, is that we're in a post-colonial psychology. And what he calls that is an auto-destructional stage, which is the oppressor will oppress for so long that the oppressed no longer have to be physically oppressed. They do it to themselves automatically.
I'm black. Do you hear me, man? Do you understand? I am black. I'm a nigga. You understand me? I was born black, I live black, and I'm gonna die probably because I'm black. Because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head.
Hey man, it's like this, man. It's like, you know, it's like it's revolution time, man. There's no questions asked. Revolution is here. You know what I'm saying? We the youth, we the young. It's time for us to break loose, you know? We don't have no freedom, no rights, man. We slaves right now. Everybody's still a slave. That's what they told us today. In other words, you still a slave. No matter how much money you got, you still ain't shit. So, you know, it's on, just like that. Just like
are really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom. Our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves.
What price are you talking about, sir?
The price of freedom is death.
What's the figure?
I mean, what are you in this for? You want power, you want revenge, you know? What is it?
It's simple, Willie. I just want to be free.
Hey, peace to the family. Welcome to another episode of We Charge Colonialism. Appreciate everybody who continues to support and tune in to our podcast. We got a special guest, and I'm going to have a powerful discussion this afternoon. So besides that lunch that you're getting for your tummies, we have some good food for your brain today. I am Kimbo Ajodri. We Charge Colonialism, one of the hosts and organizers of WCC. And I'm going to let our guests introduce themselves.
How you doing? Toivo Asheeke, based out of Atlanta right now.
All right. And also author, because I knew he wasn't going to say it, author of Arming Black Consciousness, the Tanzania Black Nationalist Tradition, and South Africa's Armed Struggle. Right. So I was queued up for that. So well, appreciate everybody again tuning in. Make sure you like and share the podcast. And if this is your first time, whether you're viewing now or viewing later, if this is your first time viewing our podcast, make sure you subscribe to the channel. So also make sure you go back and check out any of our previous podcasts. We just got through the month of August, Black August, that is. And right here on We Charge Colonialism, we had a series that we did on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a series for Black August, the Black August Power Hour. And for that hour, we had organizers within the Black Liberation Movement come join us as we examine the speeches and interviews of Malcolm X. So we did that twice a week for the month of August. But if you wasn't there, you're still able to go back and tune into those shows or those discussions. Also, coming up tomorrow, we're continuing at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, continuing to discuss Stolen Black Labor by Chairman Omali Yeshitela of the African People's Socialist Party. We'll be covering Chapter 4 of that book tomorrow, so make sure you tune in to that. Me, Frank, myself, and Natasha will be here tomorrow. So looking forward to having that discussion. As well as our political prisoner series. Make sure you tune into that. Last one we had brother Frank, who hosts the political prisoners series. Another Frank out of New York, who hosts that. They just covered Marcus Garvey as a political prisoner. Right, Marcus Garvey was a political prisoner. Dr. King is a political prisoner. We can go down the list. Anybody who's fighting for liberation in America became a political prisoner at some point. So, but we're all prisoners of war at the end of the day. And last note I want to make is the NPDUM convention, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Convention, is coming up next weekend. from September the 9th, September 10th. For those 2 days, NPDM, which is the mass organization of the Hoodoo movement, will be holding its 31st convention. The link to the convention is in the description. I'm also going to put the link in the chat. The convention is going to be taking place in St. Louis, but you can also view the convention online and be a part of the organization. You don't have to be a member of the organization to tune in to the convention. You'll be able to see members of the organization discuss the previous year, organizing from the previous year and the way forward for the organization as the members continue to organize to unify African people around the world and to liberate ourselves from these colonial conditions. So with that being said, got all of that out the way. We have a great discussion today. Looking forward to it. I know we kind of was talking about this last minute, but we thought it was important to have this discussion. There is a lot going on, always a lot going on under the system of colonialism, but particularly there was a shooting in Jacksonville. There were a few coups, couple of coups that has taken place recently because we can go back, but in Gabon and Niger there has been some coups, and we wanted to have a discussion around these topics, and it's interesting because Black folks was on this high for a minute because of Alabama. And I was kind of wondering, I'm like, what's going on? It looked, I mean, everybody, you would have thought that we liberated ourselves the way Black people were reacting to what happened in Alabama. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little confused that I had a few laughs at some things that I saw because people were like being like really ridiculous about it. But to me, when it happened, first of all, the first thing came in my mind was like, oh man, what's going to be the response? Because we're not in a position, and I'm not making a connection either, but that's just, how my mind is, just because we're not in a position right now to like really defend ourselves from a serious attack by this power structure. But but that high kind of, now that has gone away because this tragedy that has taken place in Jacksonville. But you had an interesting thought about it, and you were making this connection with Rhodesia and white supremacy. So you want to talk about that? I'm gonna allow you to talk about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm on my thing now about watching my time, just so I can have some this level of time, so we can have not just because I can just be disciplined. But firstly, Ikemba, I really just want to thank you really consistently, my brothers, for being very supportive of me and sort of helping to give me a level of a platform to sort of express some of my ideas. And some of the work that you all do at We Charge Colonialism, right? Like I really, this is the kind of guerrilla intellectual work that I really respect, love, and admire. I just really thank you all for all the work that you do. And for years now, I've been listening to you, and it's just great because I don't listen to mainstream news basically at all because it just corrupts your mind. I only listen enough just to kind of hear what they're saying, and then I jump off, right? So it's good to kind of just have some of this stuff. So yeah, I'm just gonna say a few quick things just to kind of just get things started. This week on my Instagram, I sort of just shared some thoughts about the connection with Rhodesia and this guy Ryan Palmeter, right? This white supremacist, racist killer who killed our people in Jacksonville, right? And I wanted to draw a connection with Dylan Roof because I did something similar in in graduate school when Dylan Roof happened, right? Because everybody was sort of, I'll never forget this, right? It's Dylan Roof, 2015. He shot up the church in Charleston, right? After praying with these Black people, my G, after praying with them, and he shot these people, right? After what, an hour, right? And then the police somehow took the man alive. I was watching news, I think it was CNN or whatever I was watching, just to kind of just listening, right? And I'll never forget it. This one white guy was talking, and he called it a racist killing. He said this is a racist kill, but then he corrected himself and said no, actually it was just crazy, or it was crazy, it was delusional. You see the shift, right? It couldn't be a racist killing, right? It had to be something that was like delusional. It had to be unsophisticated, right? Think of how they talk about Trump right now. Oh, he's immature. He's a baby. He's so stupid. You know what I mean? Like they start saying these words to like banalize or like to lessen in importance what white supremacy is, right? It's like they don't. It's almost like they're like, shh, Trump, you're not supposed to do it like that. You're supposed to, we have, you can't let them. You can't just tell them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Because racism isn't supposed to exist.
No, it's like everything is an aberration. Like, no, they just crazy, they backward, they uneducated. It's all these funny words get. So I was like, no, and so I had to kind of lay out some things. So really, the major thing that I wanted to lay out for folks is the Rhodesia connection, right? Dylan Roof, in some of his pictures, had this thing called Rhodesia, like a Rhodesian patch flag, right? And this guy Ryan Palmeter also had a Rhodesian patch. Apparently on like an army patch, right? Now, just for those who don't know, this is very, very important as a symbol of white supremacy, right? Not to draw direct comparisons, right? But what Haiti means to some black people, apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia means to the white supremacist left, right? So if I go around with a Haitian, like my Instagram name is Desaline Gorilla, that right there is giving people a particular kind of a message of what I'm hearkening to, right? That's not random. Right. So when they have Rhodesian flags on there, Rhodesia represents a particular, not just a physical location in space and time, but an idea and an ideology of white supremacy. Right. So if you allow me, I'm just going to go just briefly some quick history of Rhodesia, and then I'll just kind of pause there. But basically, long story short, yes, bingo, you see it right there. Right there, you see it. Right. He has the Rhodesian and the apartheid South African flags right there. Dylan Wolf does. Right. And that is common. Right. For many of us in Southern Africa, those flags would be the equivalent of someone having a Confederate flag here in the U.S. and talking about the old Confederate flags running around. That would be the equivalent for some of us. Right. My father and our people directly fought these people directly. Right. Not even like through other channels. No, directly, bullets to bullets. You feel me? Right. So what I want to just talk about is just give a brief history. If we want to go into more detail, we can. But basically, toward the end of the 19th century, right, a man called Cecil John Rhodes, I call him Cracker in Chief, the Elon Musk of his time, if you will, right, one of the richest men of the world of his time, right. He made his money off of the gold and diamond mines in what would become South Africa, right. Basically got, as I say, Elon Musk on purpose because got too big for their britches and basically said, no, the British, I'm bigger than the British Empire down here. I'm actually the main one doing a lot of this work. So he actually pushed forward and actually wanted to seize control over a territory that now is Zambia and Zimbabwe, right? At the time, they called it Rhodesia, and the belief then was that there was gold and diamonds to be found. They initially did not find as much as they actually wanted, although later on they would. But in order to salvage the project after he had spent so much of his own money, as well as doing some of his own maneuverings in the area through what's called the British South Africa Company, right? Basically, they began to give land grants, particularly in the Zimbabwe area, what is now Zimbabwe, right? In the Zimbabwe area for white settlers, right? And this is important in the late 19th century. There's a number of wars that are happening here and there. I could go into that if people want to, right? A number of European instigated conflicts and fights, right? But long story short, this area is basically seized by the late 19th century, early 20th century. But eventually, Rhodes can't control all of it himself, as many of them can't. He's unable to control all of it itself. And so eventually the British would take more of a hand in this particular project. But this is important because, and this is very important historically, because Rhodes also was not necessarily cool with the Boers, the Afrikaners, right? The Dutch immigrants who had been there since the late 1600s and had basically been steadily migrating, but then also themselves mixing with other European ethnic groups. Some of them also with some of the Africans, but not so much so. But they become what's called the Boers, right? They call themselves the lost Jews of Africa at one point, right? He also has conflicts with them. Yeah, they do in the Dutch Reformed Church. Some of them have some of this belief, right? In some of this belief, right? And so he also had conflicts with them. And as we already set up, they had conflicts also with the British, right? The British seeing themselves as like, we're like the good civilized whites. and the Boers being the uncivilized low-class whites, if you will, right? If you think of what C.L.R. James talks about in Black Jacobins, you have the big whites and the small whites, right? So in some sense, the British are the big whites and the Boers are the small whites, right? And so Rhodes, in some ways, is splitting from both. And some of the immigrants he's encouraging up there are also sort of splits from them as well. This is important because then in the 1900s, after two Boer wars between the big whites and the small whites, the British and the Boers, right, the Anglo-Boer wars, essentially the Boers are able to win, if you will, independence, right? It's very, very funny that even though the British won the war, they won the war, it's like the Boers won the peace, right? So essentially they were given essentially what is now called South Africa, right? And they had autonomy, right? There was a chance, I believe, around this time for the whites in southern Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, to join that, but they refused. And in 1922, 1923, they sort of have like a semi-autonomy, right? So they're under British colonial rule, but they basically run their own internal affairs as they see fit. They're also separate from South Africa, but of course they're connected. And of course you have the Portuguese colonies, particularly Mozambique, which is there to the east, and then you have Zambia, which is then northern Rhodesia, right? Which is more directly under British control, but there wasn't a very large white settler colony there, right? Now you see what's being laid out. Now we fast forward to the 1960s. As we know, Uhuru, freedom, is hitting across the African continent. At least political independence is hitting across the continent, right? Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, talks about a winds of change, right? So everybody's becoming independent left, right, and center. Northern Rhodesia, Zambia, becomes independent in 1964, right? And it was assumed that Southern Rhodesia would follow suit because even though there was a white settler population in Zimbabwe, now Zimbabwe, Southern Rhodesia, they were not very strong. They actually didn't have the numbers and the strength in terms of capital, right? Capital as in terms of military strength in of themselves, similar to, and in terms of industrial might, as say the whites in South Africa did. They were not as strong, right? They not even close, right? It was assumed that free and fair elections would eventually come because, like, you just don't have the power to. Even the South Africans are kind of like, yeah, what are you doing, right? Because like they just don't have, But the whites, they were belligerent. And they were like, no, we're not giving these niggas no power. And so in November, December 1965, they do what's called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. At the time, it was called the UDI, right? Huge thing where they say we are declaring independence from England in order to prevent them forcing us to have free and fair elections and enfranchising the blacks, right? And so Rhodesia and so of course of course you have the African liberation movements, particularly you have ZAPU and ZANU. ZAPU being the Zimbabwean African People's Union, and you have ZANU, the Zimbabwean African National Union. ZANU splitting from ZAPU in 1963. And that's a whole complicated thing I could go to if we want to later on. But essentially, these are the two main liberation forces fighting against the Rhodesians, the white Rhodesians, right? And between 1965 to 1980, a vicious civil war, if you will, or a civil war to some, or African, if you will, African liberation movement to others, takes place across what is now Zimbabwe. About 40,000 people are killed in this war. It is far more of a guerrilla struggle classic than South Africa, for example. South Africa was more IRA type, PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization type, right? It was more of like armed sabotage, if you will, right? It was similar to, for example, the Black Liberation Army in the U.S. is not, for example, taking over Mississippi, and holding that territory and fighting tanks and shooting down. That's not necessarily what the conflict looks like. Not to say it's less or more. It's just a different looking kind of a conflict. Yeah. In Rhodesia, it was classic Cuba style, Vietnam style, right? Guerrilla warfare, right? Very, very vicious. But this is important because Rhodesia was seen as the white supremacists who were holding out against Negro rule. And of course, they draped a lot of this around anti-communism, right? So they're saying, well, the communists and terrorists are taking over, so international support, right? Even though initially sanctions are put on Rhodesia, and Ian Smith is the prime minister of Rhodesia at this time, virulent racist. I mean, Bull Connor, Jesse Helms, he's all that combined, right? He just has a British, what did Malcolm say? He said, they lynch you with a Mississippi accent and they lynch you with an Alabama accent. Ian Smith lynched you with a Rhodesian accent, right?
Let me speak. It's funny you said that because I was I was looking at Ian Smith. I want you like right where you are right now. I want you to pick up right there. Your browser, like the screen, click the screen. I hope everything is okay. Something came up on my screen.
Okay,
but right where you are right now, sort of like a warning thing, but we'll see what they say in the chat. I wanted to get this Zimbabwe, right, or Rhodesia. They gain quote unquote independence when?
Okay, so Rhodesia now. Rhodesia declares independence in 1965. It's called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This is because they felt pressure from the British, and Zapu and ZANU essentially part of the mainstream argument was to say that the international mainstream argument was to say, British, you guys are the colonial power over Rhodesia. You guys should be forcing them to have free and fair elections because that's what's happening everywhere else. You did it in Ghana, you're doing it in Nigeria, you're doing it, everywhere. You see, and so they are pushing them to do that. And the white Rhodesians were feeling the pressure, also pressure from apartheid South Africa, by the way, actually, right? They also are putting pressure on them too, because they're like, you guys had a chance to join us years ago, but y'all didn't want to because y'all was beefing with us back from the old Cecil Rhodes time. You had some of these conflicts with us, so you guys have to live with this problem. So they, if you will, Rhodesia becomes independent in 1965. Now, this was more in name, I'll say, in a political statement versus necessarily too much of a change in terms of material reality, because they had always basically been semi-autonomous anyway, right? The British were not necessarily having a direct hand in things, although of course culturally they're similar. So for example, Ian Smith, a lot of poor white peasants, if you will, poor white folks from Europe and particularly in England and other parts in Europe are emigrating to Rhodesia. Those who couldn't cut it in apartheid South Africa, they go to Rhodesia, right? And Ian Smith, for example, is an Air Force pilot in World War II, so he's considered a war hero, right? He's considered a war hero, right? And so 1965 is when they get in. This Rhodesia declares independence.
Okay. Now, interesting, because you were saying some things about Occupy Tanzania, and I was wondering too, because you said that there was sort of like this semi-autonomy with the Boers, or the Boers sort of had some, I guess, territory that they control. I guess you could say whether it was autonomous or not, but from what I was hearing, it was like the British still was in control of this territory, but was allowing the Boers to do their thing. But I was wondering, like with the elections, like the Nationalist Party comes to power, what, in 1949? So is all of this more symbolism than anything, or is there like really this quote unquote democracy, because it's still a colony? African people aren't able to like really participate. But I'm just trying to figure out the white dynamic at this point.
So essentially, if you will, if you look at apartheid South Africa, again, the democracy there is between the whites. It's similar to the Democrats and the Republicans, right? One's a northern fox, the other one's a southern wolf, right? In the sense to say that the National Party was the right wing of the white settler project, right? And prior to, you have the different like more liberal parties like of Jan Smuts and these other cats who were the World War I and World War II heroes, if you will, right? They were more pro-British. They were considered more pro-British, and many of the Boers did not like these liberal whites, because they felt, we fought 2 wars against the British, and the British did put them in concentration camps, and thousands of Boers died. That actually is true, right? And so if you could think about it, now I'm here in the South, right? You will have, for example, a Southern class that's like, no, you guys were collaborators with the Yankees, right? And so why should we actually so the conflict is between them. It's not a conflict between, it's not a conflict between the black folks per se, although the black folks, of course, is on everybody's mind. And so something similar-ish is happening in Rhodesia, where you also have a swing in the political opinion in the 1950s to the 1960s between some of the liberal Rhodesian parties, and then you have who are into multiracialism. We have to kind of work together with the good blacks, the educated blacks, right? And then you have, for example, the right wing, which is like any black is an enemy, whether he's educated or uneducated, right? And that is the clash that you see happening. And so Ian Smith from the Rhodesian front, right? He represents the right wing, who's now coming into power and saying, no, we are rejecting the liberals because you guys are too soft on the blacks. Something similar is happening in South Africa too, when the National Party comes into power in 1949.
Hey, let's listen to Ian Smith for a second.
Decisions about Rhodesia's political future is Prime Minister Ian Smith. He once said that he wouldn't see black majority rule in Rhodesia in his lifetime. Is that a prediction he still stands by?
I still hope so. I believe that we would have failed in everything we had tried to do if we had to concede that that sort of thing should take place. In other words, government which depends on the color of a man's skin, irrespective of his ability. I could never accept that in principle. I think we must continue to strive for the best government in Rhodesia, irrespective of color. And this is the system in Rhodesia. It is possible for anybody, whatever his color, to come in and participate. We want the best government, not necessarily a black government, not necessarily a white government.
At the center of decisions.
Yeah, I know that was really short. It sounded like he was double talking there, man. I gotta listen to that again. It's like I never accept that in principle.
Yeah. So essentially, what he's doing there is, again, because of the strength of the civil rights movement and the African freedom movement of the time, one couldn't say directly we can't have blacks in charge, but they masked it under the anti-communism. You see what I'm saying? And so for example, what he would then be doing then, it's like, for example, in the US, people are talking about having a black independent republic or having black leadership, and people then saying, okay, well, we want Clarence Thomas to be the one to be the leader of this thing. You can imagine his argument would be, well, I'm not racist. Well, we have Clarence Thomas, we have these, you see what I'm saying? You could have them say no, we don't believe in that. We want the best. And Clarence Thomas is the most equipped. You feel me?
So good at it, boy.
And so that is the double talk that he's doing for the international, but then in the actual practice, of course, they're getting puppet leaders there to try to, say, well, no, we're working with some of them, et cetera, et cetera. But it's more to kind of the direct connection between Ryan Palmiter and Dylan Roof. Why is Rhodesia important in this way? Because in ways, South Africa, in some of the white supremacists, the global white supremacist imagination, in a way, even apartheid South Africa is not supporting white folks in Rhodesia, which was considered negative by some. So even the apartheid South African government and the British are looked at in certain sections as actually not being radical and strong enough on the white supremacy question, given how they felt they were not supporting Rhodesia enough. Do you see what I'm saying? Now, of course, from our black liberation perspective, this is nonsense, right? But within that imaginary, it's important, right? And so the Rhodesians essentially also, and we must connect this to the DRC in Congo, right? Particularly because remember, as we know, in 1961, Lumumba is assassinated, right? And what ends up happening in the Congo is important to what happens in Rhodesia. Why? Because they begin to bring in white mercenaries from across the world to fight against Negro rule in the Congo and in Rhodesia. Because it was a small white settler colony, the Rhodesians didn't have the manpower to be losing thousands and thousands of people. So they actually were encouraging white mercenaries to come down and to train with them and to help them suppress the niggas, essentially, right? And so this is why you see this continuum of a white supremacy with Rhodesia today, because those international mercenary links are still up and alive, right? They still actually are functioning, right? And that memory is still there. And so Rhodesia represents the most virulent, if you will, right? Among the Anglophone former African colonies, expression of white supremacy, right? And so when Dylan Roof and Peter and Ryan Palmiter are having the tag on them, right, they are hearkening to that legacy of global white supremacy, right? It's why, what is Dylan Roof saying? He's saying black people are, they're breeding us out of existence, right? They're taking our women, right? Black people are doing this, all those kinds of racist ideologies, right? That black people are doing as a justification for the murders, right? That is coming from a long continuum, about 150-year continuum of struggle. And if you read Gerald Horne's book on the region on Southern Africa, 2017 book, I believe, on the region in Southern Africa, right? He draws some really great connections between some of the in the Civil War in the U.S. There were actually a number of white Southern African, white folks who were colonizing Southern Africa who were joining in the Civil War for the Confederates against things, right? And then in the Boer Wars, you have also some of the Confederates right? Former Confederates, if you will, who are supporting the Boers against the British, right? Because they're saying the British are actually being soft on the blacks. And so we have to support the Boers against the British. You feel me?
Yeah.
So, and of course, the idea of white America, the British are a former colony, colonial master, whatever. So there's that thing there, right? So I mostly want to draw that connection to people, that it's not random. It's not he was socially awkward, he was not liked, and then he was having mental issues, etc., etc. They're weaponizing mental health in a conservative fashion to emphasize and to defang the deep sophistication of this white supremacist global project. Now, does this mean that there was a person in a suit who told Ryan Palmer to go shoot these people? That could or could not be. It is not necessary, because as we know, this is institutionally created, right? And so he is tapped into, you see his online profiles, he's tapped into all these white supremacist sites, right? And it's also not an accident that this happens in Jacksonville, Florida, right? As we know, Florida is very much split, right? Florida of Jacksonville is not the Florida of Miami or Orlando, right? Literally from Jacksonville up through here, Georgia, right? Savannah, up through Charleston, up even to parts of North Carolina on the coast. That, as some people will call it, the Gullah Geechee corridor. It also is where you've historically had some of the largest concentrations of Black people historically in the United States since the slave trade. Why? Because it's by the coast. And as we notice in simple business stuff, if you're by the coast, these plantations, particularly rice plantations on the coast, you can now get your export stuff out to global market cheaper if you're on the coast, versus if you're in Alabama or Mississippi, you have to travel further, right, from those internal areas to now get to the coast to export to the global way. So in Georgia, for example, the majority of Black folk have historically never been in Atlanta, right? That's a very recent phenomenon historically. They've only been in the Georgia Low Country, right? When Sherman is marches through Georgia and he's burning plantations on the way after he sacks Atlanta, he meets with the Black leadership in Doreen, right? Doreen is right there in that Savannah area, right? And that's actually where the highest concentration of Black folk is, and that's where Field Order 15 comes out, and the idea of 40 acres and a mule. Right. So the attack in Jacksonville, in my opinion, is also a direct attack on that power base of Black folk. And of course, in the place where he shoots people, he shoots them in the Dollar General, man, the dollar store, man. I used to be going to the dollar store when I had no money. So literally, it's poor Black people who are being shot in these areas. And he tried to get to the HBCU. Right. So these are the things we have to highlight. And again, the Rhodesian thing is critical and important. It's not like a minor thing. That and that continuum between Dylan Roof and Ryan Palmer, all these white supremacists are inspired by it. And the mercenary tradition, and many of those actual mercenaries who are putting down Black revolt in Congo and in Rhodesia, or at least trying to, right? Many of them are still alive, and their ideas and their legacies are still alive. They have never been taken to no international court of justice, right? But they be taking all of the Africans and the third world people to international courts of justice. But how about these people here who are Americans, British, French, etc.?
And it's interesting. I don't know why I started thinking about Trump as you were speaking, but I'm thinking of how these racist white supremacists they let them off the hook. Is that the saying? Because they may have done something for a Black person or for some Black people, as if that means that these people are not race. Like a white supremacist, there couldn't be a good gesture, right, by someone who's racist or a white supremacist, right? That's even the slave master, the quote unquote the enslaver of African people, would do something nice, or what we say, good, relatively good, to one of his slaves, that would be looked at as a good gesture. But at the end of the day, he's still a slave master. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe you will have white supremacists who will vote for a policy of I don't know why it lose me right now, when you let the slave manumission.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
May support manumission. Does this mean they don't uphold the system of white supremacy? Right. Abraham Lincoln himself said he doesn't want to make jurors and lawyers out of Black folk. So that's just something to keep in mind. But no, there's a lot that was covered. I think it is important too to just like really understand white supremacy as a global phenomenon, or some people don't like that term, but white political economic domination, racism as a global phenomenon. And I think you connected those dots. It's important. It's a history of support for white supremacists globally, right here in the United States, whether it's support for Nazi Germany. The reason why they were slow to get involved in the genocide or the Holocaust that took place over there is because a lot of people in positions of power here were all right with it. They was fine with what was taking place, right? And how there is no peep out of the or any uproar over the second, it was the Second Reich, I think, who exterminated the Namibia people. Was that the second or third?
Second Reich. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something, I had to find out on my own, just coming across some documentaries, because there's no, it's not as part of our common dialogue as the way the Jewish Holocaust is, right? And for reasons, but there's this global support for racist states, organizations, and groups right here, and on the outside of America, they support those groups here in the United States. That's why you have neo-Nazis in the United States, right? So I appreciate you bringing this up. Was there any more points? You did say some historical stuff, but I feel like it's for another conversation, because you was, as a historian, I was just like, okay, listening to this and had some questions, but I wanted to let you cook. Was there anything else you wanted to add on this?
For that, no. I think again, it's just to make that connection, and actually, these connections can transition well just to the few comments I do want to make on some of the coups in the Sahel, and now recently we have this coup in Gabon, because some of the ways, like one thing I do, and this may not be as popular sometimes on the Black left or in some of our Black spaces, but we do have to have, on some level, not on all levels, not at all times, but we do have to have some level of understanding of the differences between these white supremacists. They are different. They do operate in different ways, and they have different justifications, right? And it's not just, yes, the white supremacists, right? But we have to, there are differences in things we have, and there's rivalries among them that we have to be able to understand, to be able to figure out why certain things are happening and why they seem to be in conflict, and how we cannot be fooled by some of the things they're doing. And we must always, they say, keep your eye on the sparrow, right? Say his eye is on the sparrow, right? We have to always keep our eye on that while understanding their things and how it impacts us. So I think it actually transitions well to some of the stuff, and basically France's falling African empire, if you will.
Yeah, well, before you get into that, it's just another point. I'm glad you brought that up too, as far as just like there's ideological differences, right? And we have to be wise enough to see that and be able to play that, play them against one another, right? Because if there's this appearance, at the end of the day, they can come together and say, hey, it's us against them, right? So we have to move in a way where, and I'm saying strategically, where one or the other doesn't feel threatened by the way that we're moving. Though we're not saying that we're not a threat. I'm just thinking long term. But there's a way we should move where we can be able to play one group against another group. Because there is those ideological differences. They'll go to war with each other. They'll kill each other. They have done that historically. But they have found a way to sit down at the table and discuss how to move forward. They'll sign contracts, treaties, and so forth for how they're going to move forward as it pertains to the rest of the world. And we can go, to the Pope, Dum Diversas, Inter Carretera, the Treaty of Tordesillas. These things where they're breaking up the world, the Berlin Conference, and on. G7, where they sit down. So I think that's important. I wanted to pull this up too, because I came across this story the other day, and I'm not going to go into the story, but just to show people that these aren't singular events. Here in Pennsylvania, And this would have been, I'm in Pennsylvania, so this would have been like really close to home.
I saw this. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up.
Hey, when I saw this, I was like, oh my goodness. I don't know how close this is to Philadelphia, but just being in Pennsylvania and this would have been, man, Philadelphia probably would have been on fire. I'm not gonna lie, if this would have took place, but this could have been different. Armed white man in camouflage vested turned away from black church, full of mass shooting attempt day after Jacksonville dollar store attack. Right. So these people are out here. You have, going back to those differences in regards to they have when it comes to black folk. There's people who just want to see us exterminated, wiped off the planet. Yeah. There's people who like, hey, you guys are too extreme. But at the same time, they want to exploit us and oppress us, exploit our labor and so forth, right? So they don't want to really see us equal, to them. But they may not be calling for our extermination. But at the end of the day, both of those policies equals to the genocide of African people. So yeah, I know you wanted to go into what's happening in the Sahel. We can do that. If you had any thoughts on this too, you can add on, but we can transition as well.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. And again, in my own analysis and kind of my own research and stuff on like slave revolts and rebellions, I'll just say this. They suppressed historically so much knowledge of slave revolts and rebellions, even at the time, because at the time you couldn't. They didn't want people to know how extensive this.
Yeah, motivate and inspire people. Yeah,
and then also sometimes it's again back to their own rivalries, right? Because then the political party who's not in power can say, "You see, under your watch, you allowed all those rebellions and things to happen, so we need to be coming into power," right? So a lot of it also is that. So, for example, the idea that Nat Turner, for example, is more actually normal and regular than we may think, right? In the sense that there were many of those types of things. But yeah, no, to switch in some ways, and in some ways it kind of connects. And again, I'll go back historically a little bit with this to say this. So with the French, right? And then I'll say a few things just broadly because I do think that things are still in motion with what's happening in with Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Conakry, Mali. Note there were also was a coup in Chad recently, and then of course just now has been Gabon, right? I'm going to say a few just things about those in a bit, but just to give people some broad sketches of things, and also to get people need to understand the desperation of France right now, right? When you take a hungry man's food, they're going to fight. There's no negotiation with people who are. There's no negotiation. Yeah. And it's important that people understand the weakness of the French Empire. Historically, actually, right? And I think so. Basically, long story short, to go back to our 1960s moment, right? Uhuru's hitting a lot of the African continent, right? And what ends up happening, and what's happening essentially is that the French, because of their weakness economically, right, within the global capitalist reordering, particularly after World War II, but really, I would argue, post the mid 19th century. France is really falling as a world power, right? The only thing keeping the French upright is their African colonies in particular. That's really the only thing really keeping them upright, right? Unlike the British, who were able to, again, we can go into details of why, but they were able to manage their empire differently, right? Mm-hmm. Some would say more efficiently / better, whatever you want to call it, right? And they were able to control things in ways that the French were unable to do so. So the person I think people have not spoken about, and I think I understand why. Sankara, most definitely, Thomas Sankara of gets a lot of talk right now from Burkina Faso. Absolutely, Sankara will get a lot of talk as he should. But I do want to go back to another cat in Guinea Conakry named Sékou Touré, right? And Sékou Touré, of course, at the time in the 1960s and 70s, is one of the most virulent and strong, if you will, African communist / socialist, right? And very much a Black internationalist in terms of his direct speaking to and connection with the Black American struggle. If you look at the Black Scholar Journal between the 1969 and to I want to say the early 1980s, right? He's publishing very regularly there and speaking to Afro-America. Carmichael eventually goes there, right? To stay there, hence Kwame Ture, becomes his new name. Kwame with Kwame Nkrumah, and then Toure with Sékou Touré. So I bring him up because as Uhuru is hitting the continent, the French realize if we lose these colonies, and if these African liberation movement folks actually do nationalize national resources, if they actually begin to reorganize colonies from being export-driven models to the metropolis, and then reconvert them to actually supporting and building and uplifting their people, our shit's cooked. So what Portugal and Spain are now, so you'll hear a term called the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. They are literally some of the poorest economies you will find in the world, but you would never actually know, given how they dress up some of the economics and the political economy around this, right? France would be on that level, and as far as I'm concerned, is basically on that level. But long story short,
who's the G?
The G is Greece.
Oh, okay.
Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And if you were watching the Greek debt crisis, we can also, there's whole combos we can have on that. But basically, the French say, okay, cool, we have to manage this independence thing, right? And what the French did that was different than the British position around their colonies was, you guys ain't never gonna be white. So we have no problem having your kings, your Asante Hini in Ghana. You can do whatever you want. You ain't never gonna be us, right? Mm-hmm. The French position was to say, some of you can, right? Yeah. Like, come on, whatever. So the évoluer, you can be evolved. You can actually, if you renounce the African, you can actually become, right? So they did, in ways more so than the British, have a trained intellectual African class, if you will, right? Particularly around Paris, right? And so in some ways they tapped into these linkages with the conservatives amongst them and said, here's how we're going to manage this independence. It's funny, if you look at Democracy Now! Right now, there's the gentleman who was speaking on Gabon. He was saying that literally the first president of Gabon, he didn't even want independence for Gabon. He's like, no, we want to stay with France. And the French had to convince him to have independence and say, no, it won't be a real independence. Don't worry. You're going to, everything's going to be.
It won't be real.
Don't worry about it. It's okay. It's okay. We got you.
But isn't that what, and I guess you probably touched on it, but I think all of the African colonies, except for Guinea, yeah, Sékou Touré, what you mentioned, he was like, I'm cool. We going over here.
Yes,
but everyone else was like, wanted to be part of that
this new what the French basically were saying is, we're going to give you this independence. We're going to allow independence, but economically you will be within this broad French, empire, multiracial. Back like Ian Smith in this multiracial. Indeed, right? And because previous to, the colonies did have some level of representation in the French Parliament, right? Remember, someone like if you look at Arquette out of Senegal, I should know his name. Negritude, not MS is Martinique. Leopold Senghor, right? So Senghor would be the par excellence of that conservative move, right? Okay, I'll come back to that later. Anyway, I'm to focus. Basically, the French.
It's a lot, right?
It's a lot. The French essentially, right, create a model where basically the central banks of these former French colonies all had the French central bank in control of them. Why is this important? Because what ended up happening, so for ECOWAS, for example, why ECOWAS is important in all this is even though they do have a united currency in a particular way, right? What is important about this as a legacy of this negotiation is that these former Francophone African countries, in a way, buy the French franc, which artificially increases its demand and the idea of its value in the global financial markets, which artificially increases France's position of power within the euro. Because remember, what's also happening post World War II with the Marshall Plan is you're having the embryo for what would become the European Union, right? Mm-hmm. You have something called the ECC. First, it's like the gas, oil, and whatever conglomeration and steel. Basically, so Europe can now build, right? And so this is happening simultaneously with these African liberation movements, and France in particular needs these colonies to rebuild, right? They need these colonies to be able to extract surplus value from them, to extract raw materials from them, manganese, cobalt, coltan, gold, uranium, to rebuild its economy, to be able to now, from the ravages of World War II. So what they end up doing is they put the French central bank had control over the central banks of all those countries to ensure their economic policies were beneficial for France. And
why wouldn't France just get all of these resources from France?
Yeah, well, as we know, they ain't got none. You know what I mean? They ain't got none. They ain't got no. They ain't got no.
Come to Africa. Huh?
They gotta come there, right? And that's essentially, again, what they end up doing, right? And so, if we now, and so I bring up Secretary because Secretary has a very famous quote. I'm going to paraphrase. He basically says, "We would rather be poor and free than rich and slaves." Right? Essentially, is the quote, right? He says it way more beautiful than I did, right? But essentially, we would rather have our chains. We'd rather be free and without chains, right? Than have chains and be rich. Right, and so he rejects that, and they make him pay for that, right? Before the French leave Guinea-Conakry, they destroy everything, everything the French built, like a temper tantrum. Say, oh, so you gonna say no? Oh, all right. Bang, bang. They start destroying everything, every road, every railway, power lines, everything. They just burn it.
That's uncivilized.
Very, very right. And so if we fast forward to now, what's happening now, right? I'm not going to say too much about details of these coups because, again, they're still in motion and we just bluntly don't know where they're going to go. And there are some coups that are very positive and become radical outcomes. And then there's some that are very conservative, right? And I would basically split these coups into two categories: Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, and Mali. That, I think, have potential for progressive / Pan-Africanist revolutionary potentials. Chad also had a coup recently. I don't put Chad in the same category as those four because the Chad situation is different, particularly because they have a lot more French troops in Chad. And given where Chad is located in the wider Sahara and Sahel, it's a little different. Gabon, I also bluntly don't put in the same category as Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, and Mali because the Gabonese folks who have taken over power, unlike some of the other ones before, were lockstep in this particular family that's been in control of Gabon since 1967. Right? So I am actually I'm watching them very closely, and they're smart. And in this Democracy Now! Interview that came up right now, the argument thesis here is, and I agree with it, is that they made this coup on purpose because they realized that the popularity across Africa right now of the previous four coups that I spoke about, the stolen election that they believe happened this last weekend in Gabon, they felt that the people themselves would rise up in a particular kind of a revolt, and they tried to get ahead of it in order to place themselves as actually, no, we actually are trying to deal with this, et cetera, right? And so they themselves have directly been benefiting materially, financially, and they were also part of the repressions of the people throughout this regime. The guy who apparently is in charge right now, he served both son and father very well, right? So it was a tactical, practical intervention that not necessarily was anti-imperialist, although the people are having an anti-imperialist discourse, right? So I think it's important to make that differentiation. And I have fears in Gabon that if things don't go a particular way, there might be some blood in the streets there in Gabon because I think the people are wanting something more progressive and radical than the current military regime, or there could be a conflict within that military regime, but we don't know. Now, to return briefly to Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, and Mali, particularly Niger, which is the more recent one, right? I don't want to say too many things, right? But again, back to what I spoke about the need that France has for these colonies. 25%, I believe, of their some of their power sources, right, is coming from the uranium that they're getting from Niger. 25%. That's 1/4. That's not small, right? If it was 5%, it would be big. But this is 25%, right? And France actually economy is in shit street, just to be very blunt about it. If you actually look at some of the political economic numbers, if you look at some of the economic data, right, France is in crisis. Huge crisis, worse than the US crisis right now. This war in Ukraine really is tipping them over to the edge, right? Because this war, that's why actually the Europeans, if you listen closely, they want this damn war to end. It's the Americans who are driving the entire thing, right? It literally is crippling them, right? And what we're seeing right now is this anti-French fervor. And so it's why France is going to fight desperately to prevent particular kinds of radical outcomes here. It's why the ambassador in Niger, arrogant as he is, literally refused to even come when he was summoned by the new leadership in Niger, and they refuse to leave. Everybody, for those of you who know the international relation law, me coming as a son of an ambassador, right? When they tell you to leave, you get your behind out. This French, he said, I ain't going nowhere. And so, but basically, because they wanted them to say, okay, cool, are you going to attack us? Because they want them to attack the French ambassador there in order to give them justification for military intervention.
Yeah.
And so that arrogance there is to say, those of you who like your Game of Thrones, he's refusing to bend the knee.
It's crazy. It's like somebody in your house sitting on your couch and you telling them, hey, you got to leave my home. Oh, I'm not going nowhere.
Nope.
Right. But if you attack that person, you should be in the court of law, you should be justified. But that's not how the supremacists play, though.
No.
That's a justification for them to go into to Gabon and attack Gabon, because you touch it because the embassy is supposed to be how do you say it, like not sovereign, but it's a territory that's basically France territory.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
So it would be like attacking France. Is that the same situation there in Gabon? I would assume.
Yeah. In Niger, and all it is the same, and that's sort of why they're turning off the power and electricity.
Yeah, I'm in Niger. Yeah,
doing all those things around. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I have hope for those four: Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea Conakry, and Mali. But what I would say is this, and I do think that on the left we have to get a little bit more explicit with this, right? They have to do things to earn our support, right? I don't just believe, again, some of us who come from the continent, we've seen too many of these damn coups, many. And unlike the United States, in where we're coming from, this leftist language, anti-imperialist language is very common, right? Even the conservatives know the anti-imperialist language. So for us, we're not as hype when we hear people sometimes saying the anti-imperialism, global capitalism, because they say this, a lot of people say these things, right? We have to see what they do. So for me, one of the main things that we need to see done, and it's already kind of happening, is cutting of any and all trade with France. All those four countries, in my opinion, to slash every bit of trade that they're sending to France immediately. That has to happen immediately, particularly the gold, not even particularly, everything, every last crumb. You're not sending nothing there, right? That's number one. And number two, and I think this is very, very, I think it's the most important thing we must see if we want this to actually have the long-lasting impact we all are deep down dreaming and wanting. Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea Conakry, Mali, in my opinion, straight up, must do what Rodney demanded happen in the 6th Pan-African Conference in Dar es Salaam. They must abolish the borders between those states. They must become one political economic unit. There is no way they're going to protect this revolution if they remain in their individual countries. Because those borders, even if you just look at a map and you look at what's there, remember, this is a desert, people. It's not like it's like people in all of these places. They're in congested particular areas. It is a desert. And it's very important that some of the justifications that they're using for the coup d'etat, right? There is also a ramification of Libya. When the NATO invaded Libya and killed Gaddafi, what ended up happening is Libya had the 6th largest weapon stores in the world. When they took down Gaddafi, all those weapons went on the black market. And so what has happened with all these quote-unquote terrorist groups across the Sahel and Sahara, they got access to all these weapons for free or for highly cheap amounts. Hence, it's part of why the justification, again, why also the French, that we figured out years ago, were actually behind Al-Shabaab and some of these other terrorist groups. Why? They want to always say, you need us to fight these guys. So they funded some of these terrorist groups that were attacking these different African countries, and then said, we will come in and help give you the expertise and the military support to stop these people attacking your folks. You feel me? And so this was the justification that they used, how they created conflict, right? How they themselves keep people attached to them. And so for Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea Conakry, Mali, we must demand that they abolish those borders between themselves and that they unite under one political economic union. And they must figure out how they want to make that work. If they don't do that, they're just not going to be able to do what we hope and want them to do. And even if you look at those borders, if you look at those borders right now, right? This map is most definitely a solid one, But one of the maps you would also really like to look at, just some of the maps, is looking at just the topography. It is a desert. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that corridor there, most of Niger is desert, right? So it's not like there's like a border, a clear borderline between some of these places, right? People historically have always been going across there for years and for hundreds of thousands of years, right? All these borders, as we know, are just not real. They were created by the Europeans, who took certain things that were happening and then utilized them for their own good. So I think that it's very, very important that they split completely with the French, right? Completely, right? Number one. Number two, they have to unite politically into a one single political and economic unit. Of course, it takes time for that to actually be more, have more. Oh, thank you. Perfect, right? Perfect. That map, particularly on the right, if you look at some of that stuff, right? This is sort of what we're talking about in terms of some of the desert, right? In terms of just what the topography looks like, right? Note on the map on the right, it's more green down by Abidjan, Accra, Lomé, Lagos, Porto Novo, right? Versus when you're going up toward Ouagadougou and Niamey, right? You see it looks different. Right? This is important to talk about the scarcity of resources there, right? And also the need that they're going to have for food to be able to feed people in a particular kind of a way. Because if you're in a desert, again, it's very difficult, as we would understand, to grow food in certain types of ways, right? So I think it's very, very important that we must demand. And I think thirdly, and then very straight up, this is where particularly when you think of Aimé Césaire's resignation letter from the French Communist Party in the 1950s, right? The French working class, they need to get their asses together and protest and support these coups in West Africa. This is what we know the French can protest. We know they can. They've been protesting over the increase in the retirement age from 62 to 64, whatever the rate is, or so from 60 to 62. They have been protesting. They actually do go blow to blow with the police out in France. It actually does happen. Unlike this, some of the strikes in the US, they're not actually fighting the police physically, right? They are fighting the police in France. They actually can do it. This is where the French working class has always been useless. They actually, this is the time for them to strike. But the reason why they won't strike, and this is some of the failures of the European Marxists and their ideas of class struggle on a global level, it's not in their interest to strike to support West Africa, because if they do that, if they actually split, it will destroy their industries. Yes, it's true. Yeah. If this succeeds, the French working class there will suffer. And their worst nightmare is to become what Portugal and Spain are. Those places are broke. Italy is broke. It's why they turn to a fascist for saving in Italy right now. She literally is trying. This new president, prime minister, whatever, is trying to regenerate Mussolini's name. Is completely anti-immigrant, right? Even though they need the immigrants to actually keep themselves afloat, right? So. I say all this to say the three things again is just that we need to be looking at particular things, and we can't just be too enamored. As I see some folks on the left right now just too enamored and too happy and supportive. It is really is a very particularly US-centric idea around these coups, because people heard socialism and anti-imperialism. They haven't said socialism. They said anti-imperialism, anti-France, anti-all this. So people get too excited. And it's good to be excited, but we also must demand things from people.
Right. The opportunists, I think, are looking at this as an opportunity for them to put forth their own, agenda, because that happens even within the states when there's struggles and reactions to colonial conditions, or there's police brutality, or just racist acts of the state. You see a lot of allies and people in solidarity that you don't see on a regular basis come out, but they're looking for opportunity to put forth their own agenda, not necessarily struggle on behalf of the African working class. There's another thing that you had mentioned, which I unite. Here on We Try Colonialism, we unite with those proposals. Everything you put forth, I would say that the thing about the trade. I was wondering, because I was thinking that, how would that look in regards to cutting off trade? Because that needs to be done, right? But I'm thinking about how, will they suffer any more than they already suffer? You look at Nigeria, almost 50% of the population is in poverty, but I just be thinking about how much worse can it get? And should there be like some sort of plan? You mentioned the borders and all of that. There has to be an economic plan in place. And this is the weakness of these African states where you're talking about ECOWAS in particular, talking about attacking Niger. You're supposed to be support. How can you economically support this state and help them go through this transition? Because obviously, you know, the conditions that were Niger was in, Gabon was in, you know, it was I'm trying to say not favorable, but you know, the conditions in there, I guess you could say is favorable or whatever, unfavorable, but the conditions allow for something like this to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Colonial conditions, neo-colonial conditions. So how do we prevent this from happening? How do we sit down at the table? Military intervention is not going to solve the problem. There needs to be a revolution in the economy and the politics in these countries. And France isn't the answer. So how Africa, I feel like, is not shown that they're ready to support these countries who may have that want to put forth a policy of cutting off trade with their former colony.
Yeah.
But who is Ghana? Is you know, Sierra Leone? Is Nigeria? Are they going to step up to the plate and say, hey, you know, do trade with us? What you were selling to them, you know, we'll buy this amount. You know what I'm saying? Or Tanzania or Kenya say, hey, we're going to pick up the slack. You know, you can do trade with us. We'll pick up the slack that you get what I'm saying. So we're, you know, I think like that has to be in place. And if that's not in place, these countries are going to really suffer. Because essentially it's going to be not just Europe sanctioning these African states, but it will be African states as well sanctioning, doing the bidding of you know, the European states.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll say it this way: ECOWAS for me has never been revolutionary, radical, or even moderate. They've always ECOWAS's creation purely has been to serve France. That's the only reason why ECOWAS exists, right? Now, yes, Nigeria is in it, and yes, there's others there who are in it that are not former Francophone countries, but ECOWAS, generally speaking, has existed in order to serve the EU and to serve the Europeans in that sense. And what I mean by serve, and I mean it in terms of the political economy and the social organization of their economies, right? In terms of even who's owning the industries and the businesses, where is stuff going? How is it being priced? Who's in charge of certain things? Are you suppressing labor revolts? Are people asking for higher wages, right? You feel me, right? It's designed for that, right? We want them sometimes to be a little bit more than they are, but it was never designed for that, right? And so I think ECOWAS for me they should never look to ECOWAS. ECOWAS for me has lost since it was founded, it lost legitimacy, in my opinion, right? So for me, ECOWAS is not where they need to look. Nigeria, I will say something very interesting about Nigeria. I think people do need to know with Nigeria. Nigeria, while they call it one country, it is very much not. It is very much, at the very least, two. Some may say more, right? Those of you who know is that what they have in Nigeria is a system where at different points in time, it will be someone from the north who's president and someone from the south, north for 2 terms, south for 2 terms. Right now, part of the reason why the president has been so belligerent against these coups is because he's from the south. And the south has generally been the more Anglophone, generally been the more in ways more pro-Europe, you can argue pro-Western element, although of course you do have, of course, a revolutionary activities and comrades who are on the ground fighting that, right? You generally do have that, right? But it is more Anglophone, and it would always be more anti what's happening in this area of the Sahel in particular, partly because they also are ethnically not as close to them as those from the north are. So, for example, if you look closely at Nigerian politics, the northern politicians have completely rejected any kind of military intervention in the Sahel, right? Because they actually are ethnically closer and also historically in ways closer to them in particular ways. And so Nigeria also is a terrible model in some ways, right? Because Nigeria has all that oil wealth. What have they done for their people, right? The government's there in the south, both north and south, right? They've not actually done what needs to be done for their people. Nigeria should be one of the richest countries in the world just off of its own, right? But it's not, because the distribution has not been there, right? Because the West has on purpose caused as much confusion as they could in Nigeria in order to be able to control the oil and the gas wealth, right? And also be able to control the market. Nigeria has 120 plus million people. They want to control that market of consumers, right, as well. So I would say that, and the AU, again, also the AU has always, again, there's certain things the AU, has some level of influence on, but the AU, again, they have little power in this. And to answer your question more directly, what I would say is, listen, this is not something that's going to be very easy. This is why I always go back to Haiti, and I go back to Haiti post 1804. I really do believe that, I know myself, I just want to do a lot more research on Haiti from 1804 to the U.S. occupation, right? It's important. There's a scholar named Mimi Scheller, who's written some books comparing some of the political economies of Jamaica and Haiti in the 1830s, the mid 19th century. And one of Mimi Scheller's thesis from her work has been that because the Haitians did have a land reform policy after enslavement, unlike others, the Haitian farmers, small farmers, and rural community were actually some of the richest in the Americas because they actually had land ownership. Now, this is very interesting because if you look at the mainstream economic indicators, so things like GDP growth, things like economic growth, right? Some of these kinds of methods for assessing particular kinds of economic activity, it is really only designed to measure particular types of things, not necessarily other things, right? So you can have a high GDP. So for example, Gabon has always actually had a very high per capita income, right? Mostly because on the African continent, I think they have one of the highest in the African continent, mostly because they have oil, a smaller population, right? But the distribution of the resources has been unequal, right? And so I think with Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Conakry, and Mali, they are going to suffer in the short term, period, full stop. There's no way you're going to get around that. I think what they're going to have to be is creative. They're going to have to go back to certain traditional grassroots and grassroots forms of economic cooperation and trade that will maybe it means you don't sell all that gold on the gold market, right? Because the Russians and the Chinese can't also buy all these things up. Or if you just do that, you're simply now dependent on the Russians and the Chinese, right? And not to say the Russians and the Chinese are the French, but at the end of the day, if I'm paying for 3/4 of your budget, I control your economy. So whether I'm an ally or not, it's irrelevant, right? On one level, right? So they're going to have to actually indeed, I think military aid they're already getting from the Russians, right? It's part of why you see the military, the Russian flags running around these areas. It's mostly because they're providing guns. And as much as we in the Black movement want to support these people, we ain't sending them guns and ammunition. So the reality is they're not going to protect this revolution necessarily with words and some of our protests here, right? They're going to have to physically defend it. And the Russians are going to be essential for that, right? The Chinese are very good merchants. They're going to trade with whoever. So they don't particularly care. They go, you revolutionary? You're going to trade. Here, you conservative? You're going to trade. They're not particularly worried, right? So I think that it may actually mean they closed some of the gold mines. They closed the uranium stuff. Remember, uranium mining is environmentally terrible for the soil. And remember, the French, people don't talk about this too. The French have tested nuclear weapons and dumped a whole bunch of nuclear waste throughout that Sahara and Sahel region. No one's talking about that, right? And so I actually think it may have some bravery to happen to say, yes, we are not going to sell this thing. Why do I think that's important? If we look at the Haitians, part of the critique of Toussaint, when Toussaint has his constitution in 1801, and when Toussaint is coming into power, is his belief is we had Haiti. He believes Saint-Domingue had to restart the sugar plantations because at that time sugar was like gold, oil. It was he wanted to restart that and actually start refining sugar, right? So you could increase the price of that export in order to now get into the global market, get foreign currency to begin to economically develop as a bourgeois revolution in a certain way. The masses prevent that from happening because they were saying, no, we don't want to go back to the sugar plantations. Coffee, because coffee is less intensive of a labor, but we may do it. We also may not. And so that right there is part of some of the reasons why even before the French invaded 1802, he's having rebellions against him consistently. That was, what I think was brave. And in ways, yes, Haiti is off the sugar market throughout most. I mean, they are selling some of it, but not as much, of course, during slavery, right? By enfranchising your people, redistributing land, and having more of an peasant and small market-based economy. For example, those of you who know in Haiti, they call it the coups system, right? The coups system has been studied by a number of Haitian scholars and political economists who've kind of looked at this cooperative African-based structure that the small farmers did in the rural areas as a way to survive, but also begin to rebuild their lives in ways that were outside of the standard capitalist economy of wage labor, right? The wage labor commodification of labor in this kind of way, right? I argue that something similar has to happen in these 4 countries. It will not be pretty. Some African countries can help, but for example, gold and uranium, you're not really going to sell that like to Namibia, right? We don't necessarily need. We got gold and uranium. You know what I mean? They may have to say we don't sell these things, or if you're going to sell them, maybe particular markets in the world. But even then, it's going to be hard for them to do that. What I'm asking for is very, very difficult, and particularly some of your more mainstream Marxists will hate this because many of them, their belief would be that we want a strong, industrially robust state as the way to begin to empower a working class, and eventually you'll start seeing the withering away of the state, et cetera, et cetera. Go through some of that political thinking there, right? But I think something different has to happen, and they have to begin to reinvest in the ways people have actually already to survive. Remember, as we're saying right now, the current capitalist system has not been benefiting the majority of the people there, but they still are surviving. So the question is, what are people doing to survive already? And then what can a united, Sahelian state, if you will, do to encourage that and to empower that and to protect that is now the question, right? And I don't have any great answer. I don't know the political economy deeply.
No, but I think you're right on point because there's going to have to be a change in the economy. There's going to have to be a revolutionary change in the economy because the economy, as we know of today, this global economy, African people are tied to it, right? And if we continue, you have mentioned Haiti and the sugar. If they were to continue to produce sugar, they will be tied to the global economy, and that that relationship would still have existed. And I think there had to be something where even if the Africans, ideally, maybe it would have went over well if the African laborers, on those plantations had more control over their labor, right? But even in that situation, they're still tied to this global economy, right? Because we'll have, and this is the situation we have today. You go to Ghana with the cocoa, no matter what type of policies they put in place and how much more resource or control they try to give to the farmers there, they're still locked into the economy. Congo, and I understand the policies too of them wanting to refine in Ghana. That was a bold move, so I don't want to neglect mentioning that. In Congo with the mines, them letting small miners, gain more control. And so these sort of things, but these are reformist sort of moves. There's still that relationship with these foreign entities who continue to dominate these economies. And all it does is sustains the colonial relationship. So there definitely has to be this transformation in the economy, and I'm all for what you propose. There was enough. If I can just pull, I wanted to reference something. I'm going to put a link in the chat because we've been talking about France and colonialism and neo-colonialism. And if you wanted to read up, and I don't know if you had any suggestions too, but if y'all wanted to read more up on sort of like this history of neo-colonialism and how France has been operating for the last 4 or 5 decades, around 6 decades in France, check out this article. Not going to read it. I just wanted to show it's the Rajin Harsh, French neo-colonialism in sub-Saharan Africa. And he definitely just goes through like the different methods that France uses to continue to control its former colonies, if you want to call them former colonies. So check that out. One of the things that I was reading in this article when Harshe was talking about aid and how the aid that France was sending to the colonies will actually benefit France in the end. Because most resources in Africa, they really didn't have any say on how to utilize the aid and the resources that was going there. So that money is like they was giving them that money, but that money was going to industries and was going to people and organizations that actually benefited France, and a lot of that money would go back to France. So you know, and there's definitely like some other things that are touched on in the article, and also just on the subject of aid. There's another article. I'll try to not try. I'll put it in the chat at some point. But this is a former French president. How do you say that? Is it Jorge Pompidou?
Yeah, I know how to say. Yeah, but Jorge Pompidou. Pompidou. How I would say it, but my French ain't nowhere near good.
I'm the same way. Well, this was a answer to what a journalist had put forth a question about some slogans in Chad. And he said, yes, of course we are neo-colonialists. This is a French president. The proof lies.
He said,
say that again.
No, continue. I'm sorry, I'm just reading it.
The proof lies in the fact that we are trying to help this country. We are granting her financial aid. If that is neo-colonialism, then long live neo-colonialism.
Straight up. He says straight up. No filter.
No filter.
I appreciate honesty. I mean, telling me, yep.
hey, they'll tell you. Last thing I want to, because you know we're talking about France and the economy, and I actually wrote an article on this maybe a year or two ago. I want to rewrite this article, but I was looking at the Shalina Group, just corporations operating in Central Africa, and I was writing about the Shalina Group, which is I think they're based in Dubai or maybe India. I know that the owners or the founders of the group are from India. But then there's the K Group, and that's the English name for it. And if you look at, this is what neo-colonialism looked like. So K Group is an international company founded by Joseph Ichame Kamash. I'm probably butchering the name, in 1972. K Group, deeply rooted in Central African Republic. The group, led by Yvonne Kamash, today is the largest private employer in the country and continues to expand across 4 areas: exploitation / industry and services, distribution, and real estate. Damn, the whole economy. Come on, you might as well say, right? And if you look at the exploitation and interesting use of a term, right? Exploitation. Wood, gold, diamonds, right? Timber, mines, minings, distribution. You know, I'm talking about supermarkets, food, industry services, maintenance, engineering. This is one corporation that is in Central Africa. Well, does most of its work in Central Africa, probably located in other French countries as well. But this is what neo-colonialism looks like today. All right. And because it's Africans who are allowing this to happen, you know. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that really quick.
No, I mean it's cool. No, and I honestly, I just, you know, as you know, we could have a whole thing on neo-colonialism, right? But
right.
I again, I want to be very tame with some of my comments. Again, unlike other places on the continent, I don't have deep connects in these areas where these coups have been happening. In other areas, mostly Southern Africa, that's generally my stomping grounds, and I have more connects on the ground there. So I want to be very careful with some of the things that I want to say about them. But I would just to reemphasize for people again, yes, there's a lot of anti-imperialism here, and we're happy to see that. People are hearkening to Thomas Sankara's name, which is very, very good. But at the same time, you know, Sankara did get killed, right? And I think part of the reason why he did was because he was alone. The other African countries around him did not support Sankara the way that it needed to happen, right? And I think that unlike Sankara, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry, and Mali actually they're doing this at the same time, you know what I mean? And they actually, right now, they have the popularity of the masses right now. So right now is the time to strike and go aggressive with go as far as you can right now, because right now you do have the people behind you, right? Mm-hmm. And that's going to be important because there's going to come a time when things are going to get tough. And in the West, the French are going to continue to do everything they can to try to sabotage this place. They're going to ask ECOWAS and their people in the area to do whatever they can. They're going to go and to their groups that they fund, that they know how to fund, right? And when we say groups, these terrorist groups in the Sahara and Sahel, right, that are moving across these borders, etc., that are attacking and doing, Boko Harams and doing these different kinds of things, right? We're not sitting here and saying that like Macron himself is sitting there and saying, you go here, go do that, right? But those of you who remember an old movie Nicolas Cage did called Lord of War, right? That's how they act. It is an old movie by these contractors that basically sell these weapons on these markets, and they basically trigger conflicts in these different types of places, right? That cannot be directly connected to the French officially in particular ways, right? They will do that. They're going to double their efforts in that era, right? So again, they're going to have to, in my opinion, unite militarily, come together and unite, and then we'll see how revolutionary they really are. Is it about their egos and who's the head man in charge, or is it actually going to be about what we are actually going to do for our people, right? Because unlike Secretary during his time, and then Thomas Sankara about 20-25 years later, right? They were alone. And so because of some of that, even with Secretary, as much as I do admire the man for in his late 1950s and 1960s, even into the early 70s moment, because he's alone, what ends up happening is they do become more repressive. And they actually, so part of why he's not being talked about as much is true. As radical as the man was, he did have a taste for blood. And he did do a lot of things that we just can't condone in the left ourselves, right? But I think these guys have a different opportunity. They also have a more awake Black international, particularly here in the US, that's more interested and more focused on what's happening there. Technology also makes this stuff a lot easier. We can now just see things without going through CNN or BBC or News France 1 or whatever. We can just see things directly without them, right? And so there's a lot more opportunity, but right now is for them to push the most radical things through now, because when things get tough, it's going to be tricky to do these things, particularly when people are starving and struggling. And then the French in different makeup comes and offers you bread. People will, the shift can happen, right? And so right now they have to push as far as they can. And I really, really hope that they do. And the last thing I'll say, and again, to cite some of the stuff I've been listening to now, is something that's very important. With this Gabon family, for example, what was the number that they gave for this Gabon family? They have 39 properties in France and over 70 bank accounts. If you think about Mobutu Sese Seko, right? They still don't actually they still haven't found all the man's wealth, right? Like low-key, I believe that was the richest man in the world for the longest of times, because literally the wealth of the Congo.
Who was the richest man?
Okay, me.
Oh, Mobutu?
Yeah, so my thesis, I have no evidence to directly back that up, but I believe that during the height of his power, I believe he was the richest man in the world. But smartly, he didn't claim it, right? Most of the people who are really, really rich, they don't want to be on no damn Forbes list. They don't want you to know. They don't, only the ones who want to be everybody, they don't want to be on no Forbes list, right? So I think that it was also very important about those properties that the Gabonese ruling family had, right? And also this number was the number I was listening to right now. The ruling family took 18% of the country's wealth and gave 25% to the masses of the people. So the family took 18%. And the actual country, they only gave 25%. Think about that, right?
Yeah.
Also very important, part of why Sarkozy was so adamant at the time to kill Gaddafi is that Gaddafi, as well as many of these other West Africans, part of the British critique of the French is that because the French economy is not strong in particular ways, right? These African elites who were stealing all these monies and having all these monies, they basically were fueling and financing these French banks. And they actually were helping the property markets in these places like Belgium and France, and they're funding these political parties. So many of them, Sarkozy, are getting a lot of their money from these people. And the argument is, okay, Sarkozy, you come into power, make sure to keep these people off my back while I'm out here doing what we're doing really for you. You know what I'm saying? So literally part of, again, why this coup is interesting, right? Again, these coups are interesting, right? Is again, it's also a hit to the finances of these French political parties, particularly the centrists and some of the other folks who get their funding from these donors, like large-scale donors to these things. So it's very interesting. I'm very excited about what's possible. Also, there's things that are scary too, because I don't want to see our people die in their thousands, which I think it's possible. We have to look at these things very rationally. But again, the three things I really want to demand for, I believe we have the right to make certain demands as people in the global Black left, and maybe less demands, but we have expectations. We should have expectations, right? Which is at the very least, you got to cut all trade with France at the very least, and You got to cut all that. Number one. Number two, they
Let's
must.
go.
And number two is the most important. They must politically and economically unite. If that doesn't happen, right, then eventually
Yeah.
it become a counter revolution, and then next year we'll just be having this conversation about how they failed, right? So
Right
literally,
on.
don't do that. It's actually going to hurt what they're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And that those two things I think at the very least, and then three, they're going to have to find a way, to de-link, and that's also very tied to the first thing, right? To kind of de-link from some of these the capitalist world economy in particular ways, but de-linking in the sense of not saying they're not going to have any trade, but they have to really start investing in finding creative solutions within their territory. And that actually is more possible once you've politically united and freed up movement across the borders in particular ways, and allowing people to be creative at the grassroots level to figure out ways to rethink what the economy should look like.
Yeah, yeah. And first thing, man, food, clothing, shelter, the essentials. Because once you have that, you could begin to be creative and think about other things. But with colonialism, it has undermined the ability of African people to even be able to provide themselves with those essentials. So we got to get back to that. But appreciate you being here. We need to circle back around and revisit these topics, right? See where we are. So definitely the door is always open for you to come here. You're part of the family anyway. So WCC. Appreciate everybody too for tuning in this afternoon. Said we was gonna bring some brain food for you, your lunch. So thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if this is the first time subscribing. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement Convention is next weekend, September the 9th and 10th. The the link is in the description. I also will put the link there for anybody who wants to tune in on the ground. The convention will be in St. Louis, or you can watch via virtually, I think on Zoom. So you can tap into that. Also, We Charge Colonialism will be back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern time. So tap in as we continue to examine stolen Black labor by Chairman Amali Yeshitela and have our weekly roundup. So I'll be here with my comrades Frank and Natasha. So looking forward to seeing you all then. So until next time, any last thoughts you have before we?
I said everything I gotta say today. Thank y'all.
Powerful dialogue, man.
Thank you so much, but thank y'all.
All right. Peace, family.